The sun was blazing high above the valley when Samuel Hargrove rode in, a man born of wealth, steel, and the habit of getting what he wanted. His boots were polished, his gloves clean, his horse bred for power. Behind him, the wind carried dust and the faint sound of wagon wheels from the town he practically owned. Out here, his word was law. He'd bought up half the land between Red River and Copper Hill, driving out farmers who couldn't pay the rising taxes. And today one more name sat on his list, Mary Lorne, a widow who owed 2 seasons' rent on a plot barely worth the ink on his papers. The path to her home wound between sun-bleached fences and patches of wild wheat. The land was poor, thirsty, cracked, but there was a strange peace to it. When he reached the edge of her yard, he pulled up his reins and stared. The house was little more than a shack, patched with clay and old boards, its roof sagging under the weight of years. But out front, 3 children played in the dust, laughing as they chased a chicken too stubborn to be caught. The smallest one, a girl with curls the color of wheat, tripped, and her brother helped her up, dusting her off gently. Something in Samuel's chest shifted, just a flicker. He tightened his grip on the papers and rode forward. The woman appeared from behind the cabin, a bucket of water in her hands. She was barefoot, her dress faded, but her posture, straight and steady under the midday sun, carried a quiet strength he hadn't expected. Sweat shone on her forehead, yet her eyes were calm. She looked at him as if she'd seen men like him before and refused to be afraid. "Mrs. Lorne?" he said, voice crisp, professional. "Yes," she answered. "And you must be the man who wants my roof." Her tone wasn't bitter, just honest, almost weary. He cleared his throat, unfolding the paper. "You're behind on your rent. 2 seasons overdue. By law, I have to—" She cut him off softly. "By law, you can take what's left of this place. But the law doesn't grow wheat, and it doesn't feed children." She glanced toward them, 3 small figures now gathered by the porch, watching in silence. "If you take the house today, at least let them finish their supper first." Samuel hesitated. He'd done this 100 times. Evictions, foreclosures, clean transactions with clear outcomes. But this didn't feel clean. The woman's words didn't sound like defiance. They sounded like truth. Her children, thin but bright-eyed, stood still, clinging to the edge of the doorway. The boy, maybe 10, held a stick like a toy rifle, not in threat but in protection. He dismounted, dust rising around his boots. "You have family?" he asked stiffly. "Graves," she said simply. "A husband in the field behind the hill. A father and brother who died fighting for land richer than this one." He lowered his gaze for a moment. The papers in his hand suddenly felt heavier. "I'm sorry," he said, surprising even himself. She nodded once. "You're not the first man to say that before taking what's left." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of a breeze brushing through the wheat. One of the children, the smallest girl, stepped forward timidly, holding out a handful of daisies. "For you, mister," she said, smiling shyly. "Mama says men who ride horses help people." The words hit him like a bullet to the heart. He looked at her, dusty feet, sunburned cheeks, innocence untouched by the cruelty of the world. Her hand trembled slightly as she held out the flowers. Without thinking, he crouched and took them. "Thank you," he said quietly. The girl beamed and ran back to her mother. Samuel stood staring at the flowers, wild and half-wilted, yet beautiful in their defiance of the sun. He folded the eviction paper and tucked it back into his vest. "Mrs. Lorne," he said finally, "I didn't ride out here to throw children into the dust." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Then why did you come?" He paused. The truth rose slowly, almost against his will. "To see why the land keeps fighting me." She tilted her head, studying him. "And what did you find?" He looked at the children again, at their small hands and bright eyes, at the way their mother stood between them and the world, like a shield of flesh and faith. He swallowed hard. "Something I forgot existed." She didn't answer. The wind blew gently across the valley, carrying the scent of dry grass and the faint hum of bees. The sun burned bright overhead, merciless but life-giving. For the first time in years, Samuel Hargrove didn't feel like the master of anything. He felt like a man being taught a lesson by the land itself. The next morning, the valley glowed gold under a rising sun, mist lifting off the wheat like smoke from heaven. Samuel Hargrove rode back down the dirt trail, his coat slung over his saddle and the eviction paper still folded tight in his vest pocket. He told himself he was returning to finish the job, to make it official. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the truth. Something about that woman, about her quiet strength and her children's laughter, had followed him through the night like a prayer that refused to fade. When he arrived, the same children were outside again. The boy was helping his little sister draw lines in the dirt with a stick, their bare feet leaving tiny prints. The older girl, maybe 12, was hanging washed clothes on a line strung between two trees. The air smelled of soap, bread and sunlight. It was the smell of life, humble but proud. Mary Lorne looked up from where she was tending the small vegetable patch. Her face showed neither surprise nor fear, just a calm acceptance that made Samuel feel smaller than any court or contract ever had. "You came back," she said simply. "Yes," he replied, dismounting slowly. "I'm not sure why." Her eyes met his. "People rarely are when their heart starts fighting their rules." He didn't answer. Instead, he looked at the cabin again, at the careful repairs, the flowers planted by the door, the rows of beans pushing up through dry soil. This wasn't just land. It was survival. It was faith made visible in wood and dirt. "I looked at the books last night," he said finally. "Your husband's payments were always on time. You only fell behind after he died," she finished quietly. "The crops failed that year and the bank didn't care why." He nodded slowly. "No, the bank never does." For a long moment they just stood there, the sunlight stretching between them. One of the children tugged at Mary's skirt. "Mama, is the man staying for breakfast?" The boy's eyes were wide with innocent curiosity. Mary hesitated, but Samuel spoke first. "If your mother allows it." The boy grinned. "Then she will. She always shares." And so he stayed. They sat at a small wooden table outside, where the morning breeze lifted the smell of cornbread and boiled eggs. Samuel ate slowly, watching the children chatter, their joy unbroken by the weight of the world. He hadn't sat at a table like this since his wife had passed years ago, before money became his only comfort. The laughter of these children felt like sunlight, finding its way into rooms he'd sealed long ago. After breakfast, he walked with Mary to the edge of the field. The soil was dry and cracked, but her rows were neat and hopeful. "You're working this alone?" he asked. She nodded. "With God's help and their hands." She glanced toward her children, who were now playing by the fence. "They've already learned that the land gives only when you don't give up." He bent down, scooping a handful of dirt. It crumbled between his fingers, parched, tired. "This land needs water," he said. "It needs mercy," she replied softly. "Water just helps it remember what it can be." The words struck him deeper than he expected. He stared at her, the sunlight outlining her face, her simple dress, her bare feet pressed to the earth she refused to abandon. There was no self-pity in her, only quiet grace. "I can send men to dig a proper well," he said finally. "And a pump line from the creek." Her brow furrowed. "And in return?" He shook his head. "In return, you let me see what this land becomes when it's given a chance." For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then Mary smiled faintly, not with gratitude, but with understanding. "Maybe it's not the land that needs a chance," she said. "Maybe it's the man who owns it." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "You talk like a preacher." "No," she said, "just a mother who's had to believe in miracles." By midday, the deal was done, not on paper, but in trust. Samuel rode back toward town, the sun high and merciless, but no longer cruel. The daisies the little girl had given him yesterday were still tucked in his saddlebag, wilted yet precious. When he reached the ridge overlooking the valley, he turned in his saddle and looked back. The cabin stood small but alive, children chasing chickens again. The woman in the field, straightening her hat against the wind. He realized then that this, not the grand houses or railroads or ledgers, was what wealth truly meant. To be remembered kindly by the people whose lives you could have ruined, but didn't. That evening, as the light poured over the land in gold and white, Samuel made a quiet decision. He would return again, not as the man with papers and law, but as a friend with tools and men who could help rebuild what time and drought had broken. And for the first time in years, Samuel Hargrove felt something he hadn't known he'd lost: peace. Weeks passed, and the valley began to change. The well Samuel promised was dug deep into the earth, and when the first stream of clear water gushed out under the full blaze of the sun, Mary's children squealed with laughter, running barefoot through the puddles. The soil drank greedily, darkening with life. The magnate, the same man who once rode into that valley with eviction papers, now stood beside his hired men, sleeves rolled up, boots muddy. His white shirt clung with sweat, but for the first time, he didn't mind the dust. Mary watched from the porch, her youngest daughter perched on her hip. "Never thought I'd see the rich man dirty," she called out with a teasing smile. Samuel chuckled, brushing the dirt off his gloves. "Guess money doesn't keep your hands clean forever." "Maybe it shouldn't," she said, walking closer. "Some things grow better when a man isn't afraid to touch the ground." The days grew long and golden. Every morning, Samuel rode in from town with supplies, seed, tools, and news from the world beyond the valley. He spent more time at the farm than at his grand house overlooking the hills. Townsfolk whispered, wondering what had turned the cold-hearted magnate into a man who laughed like a boy again. But Samuel didn't care for talk. He cared for what was blooming before his eyes, a patch of earth reborn under sunlight and faith. The children adored him. The boy, Jack, followed him everywhere, eager to learn how to use the shovel, how to mend a fence. The older girl brought him lemonade, made from wild lemons that grew near the creek. And the smallest, Clara, insisted on showing him every new sprout in the garden, as if each leaf were a miracle she'd grown herself. One afternoon, Samuel found Mary sitting by the well, washing a shirt in a bucket. The sun lit her hair in strands of copper and gold. He hesitated before speaking. "You could have left this land, you know. Found work in town, maybe something easier." She wrung the shirt, water dripping like silver. "Easier doesn't mean better," she said softly. "This land's hard, but it's honest. I'd rather my children grow up knowing how to stand than how to beg." Her words struck him again, that calm wisdom that came not from books or money, but from surviving storms no ledger could measure. "You remind me of someone," he said. She looked up. "Your wife?" He nodded slowly. "She used to say the same thing, about standing tall. She passed 5 years ago. I buried her under a tree that still refuses to die." For a while neither spoke. The air shimmered with sunlight, and the wind carried the smell of ripening grain. Then Mary said, "Maybe that tree's still standing because it knows she's watching you." He smiled faintly, his throat tight. "Maybe she sent me here to see what I'd become." By midsummer, the lawn farm was no longer the poorest spot in the valley. The wheat stood waist-high, golden and alive, and a new fence framed the property. Samuel's men had built a small barn and mended the roof of the cabin. But the biggest change wasn't in the land, it was in Samuel himself. The sharpness in his face had softened. He laughed more, rode slower, and started writing letters not about profit but about purpose. One Sunday morning he arrived with a surprise: 3 ponies, 1 for each child. The little ones screamed with joy as they ran to touch them, and Mary's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. "They'll never forget this," she whispered. "I hope they don't," Samuel said. "I hope they remember that some debts should never be paid, only honored." As the sun reached its peak, Mary looked around her small piece of earth, the fields alive, her children happy, the air filled with light, and said quietly, "You saved us." Samuel shook his head. "No, Mary, you saved me. I came here to take your home, but you gave me one instead." She smiled, that same strong, quiet smile that had stopped him cold on the first day. "Maybe that's how God works," she said. "He lets people lose what they think they own until they find what really belongs to them." The wind carried her words into the golden wheat, making it ripple like water. Samuel removed his hat, eyes glistening under the noonday sun. "If your husband could see this," he said softly, "I think he'd be proud." She looked toward the hill where the wooden cross stood, sunlight wrapping it in a gentle glow. "I think he already does." When Samuel rode away that afternoon, the valley behind him shimmered like a promise. The daisies that little Clara had once given him were pressed inside his ledger, the only thing he still carried from his old life. He no longer looked like the magnate who ruled with papers and law. He looked like a man who had finally learned to listen, to land, to faith, to the quiet courage of a woman who refused to bow to despair. And somewhere in that blinding, beautiful sunlight, Samuel Hargrove smiled, not as a master of land, but as a servant of grace.